I want to thank the people who went through JC3 Basics. We're going to do that again in April, and we're going to open up sign-ups for that. It's a great class, and we're really excited about having that at the church. In here, while we have been doing JC3 Basics out there, we've been going through the Gospel of Mark. And so we had a really good study, and we've been going together for 4 weeks. And I just want to share, if you haven't been a part of this study so far, my name's Luke. I'm the teaching pastor here at Jefferson City Christian Church, and I want to share with you kind of what the journey we've been going through for the last 4 weeks. First, we talked about this idea that the Gospel of Mark is ultimately about Jesus Messiah, this Old Testament figure who came to them after a long period of silence, someone that they were very excited for. They were excited for Messiah, but when Jesus Messiah came and made it personal, when God came out of the clouds into the earth and he decided to make himself personal, some tension came around. And we saw that tension very quickly from the very beginning. And I just challenge you to say that when Jesus becomes personal with you, when he becomes the God not of just the Bible, of the stage, when people are teaching, when he becomes personal with you, it could create tension in your life. But then we talked about power and authority. In the book of Mark, first 3 chapters, Jesus starts establishing his power and his authority. And we talked about the fact that the difference between Jesus and everybody else around was Jesus established his power and his authority for the benefit of others. He leveraged it for other people. Whereas as they had been experiencing leaders, even religious leaders who leveraged their power, their authority for themselves, he did it for the benefit of other people. And I challenged you with that. I said, when we have authority, if we have moral authority, or if we've been put in a position of authority, we need to leverage that for the benefit of others. We talked about the fact that Jesus gave his disciples a specific job of delivering a message. But then he warned them with parables, saying, listen, the power and authority that I've given you and the message that I've given you has limitations. It has limitations in how people receive it. Sometimes people accept it and they live it and they learn it, and sometimes they don't. And so it's limited really to our power, or his power, his authority, and his message is limited to our willingness to accept it and live it and learn it. Now that shouldn't discourage you, because Jesus also told parables to saying, listen, your job is simply to sow seeds. That's what he said. You sow the seeds. You let me do the job of saving people. My job is to have an impact in their lives. And so if we just keep do not get discouraged when people do not accept the message the way that we want them to accept it, that's not your job to get them to save them. That's Jesus' job. He took that job from us on the cross. And so we need to keep sowing seeds. That's our job. Keep doing what we're doing. And last week we finally talked about a very tough subject called pain and suffering, injustice. Where is God in pain and suffering and injustice? Because the people reading Mark were going through that very thing. And so we talked last week that Jesus is always over our pain and suffering and injustice. He's not it's not that he's not there. We may not feel like he's there, but he's watching over us. He sees what we cannot see. He is before us and he's after us. So we need to understand that Jesus is watching over us. But here's the thing. Jesus didn't just watch over us. Jesus, what we learned last week in the story is he got in the boat with us. He is actually with us in our pain and our suffering. And there's a difference between hurting for someone and hurting with someone. It's compassion. And that's why he went from the mountaintop and got in the boat. And we need to understand that when we're going through pain, when we're going through injustice, when we're going through this time of suffering, Jesus is not just watching over you. He's watching and hurting with you. Now, all good stories have to come to an end in my time with you. This week is my last sermon with you, and we're going to talk about the end of Mark. Now, I like a good story. And I think everybody here can agree, if maybe you like it in different forms, maybe you pick up a good book and you really like reading, and you like a good book and you like to read a good story, or maybe you like to go to the theater, you like to see a good movie, and you like a good story that way. Maybe you like to go to the theater, or you like I took my daughter to a play, a musical, and we watched that, and she loves watching the characters and the stories play out with music. So we all like a good story, right? But the thing we like about a good story, what makes a story really good, is what we call resolution. We want to see the thing have a resolution, right? We want to see it come to fruition, and we want to see a good resolution. But I realized as I was planning this, we don't just want a resolution, we want a good resolution. Because if we get to the end of a story and it's not a satisfying story, a good resolution for us, we're going to. That's why they created part 2, is it not? The sequel, right? They created the rest of it. Like you get to the end of the book, and just because Harry Potter found the Sorcerer's Stone, Voldemort's still alive, y'all, and we got to have another book, okay? And just because they shot down the Death Star, Darth Vader, he's still alive, right? And Luke Skywalker's still not a Jedi, and so we got to figure out. And Han Solo, he's still frozen in carbonite, and so listen, we're going to need another movie, and yes, it ended well, good, but not great, because I want to ask what's next, right? I want to know the rest of the story. And that's what I'm talking about. We want a good resolution, or we're asking that question, what's next? What's next? What's next? Well, let me introduce you to the book of Mark. Because the book of Mark, if you've ever ended that book, or you ever read through that book, it doesn't end very well. In fact, you may be confused because you get to the end of Mark. There's two different endings. There's two different endings. And it's because when they found the original manuscripts of Mark, I'm going to read to you how it actually ended. And then then you find out that some of the scholars, some of the people who found this original manuscript, they read that and they were like, seriously, Mark, you couldn't do better than that? So they started looking at other reliable sources, things that they wanted to make sure they were reliable sources, but they had to include that because they looked at the conclusion. And a lot of scholars believe they just read that and thought, you got to do better than that, Mark, because this is not ending. Well, you're not giving us the what's next, right? So there's actually two different endings to Mark if you read through your Bible there. But I want to explore this idea that maybe he intended us with that tension. Maybe he intended us to ask what's next. Maybe he intended us to think about that. And I want to talk about that for a second. And I want to share with you from the perspective of three different stories. Two of them you're really going to be dissatisfied with. Two of them, I think you're going to get to the end and say, wow, that is not the way to end this story. Okay? And then the one that I want to focus on at the very end is one that he ends. And actually, that's the one that actually makes the most sense of all, that I think we can really take away from the other two. In light of the other two being so unsatisfying, this one actually has a satisfying end, but still leaves us with the question, what's next? Okay? The first scene I want to take you to is a guy named Peter. Peter, which I told you at the very beginning of this, Mark was written by Mark through the oral perspective of the disciple Peter. He was actually telling Mark what to write. So Mark was kind of penning what Peter was saying because he was either martyred already or he was about to be martyred. And the people of Rome wanted Mark to write them the oral perspective of Peter. And so Peter is sharing the story, and I want to share his story and how his time with us ends in Mark. And if you know anything about Peter, he came to Jesus. I read you at the very beginning where he called Peter to be from a fisherman, asked him to be his disciple, right? And he stuck with Jesus. In fact, you see Peter doing a lot of things during the book and through the Gospels, some pretty crazy things. In fact, Peter was the first man, the first man to say, Jesus, you are the Messiah. He was the one that actually proclaimed Jesus the Messiah. The first, in chapter 8, is the very center of the book, where the climax of the book is Peter saying, Jesus saying, who am I? Peter saying, you are the Messiah. And when I say the first man, the very first person to actually do it, the first thing is that a demon actually is the first person that actually proclaimed Jesus the Messiah, or the Son of God. Peter was the first man to say it, right? And so Peter says, Jesus, you are the Messiah. And what's interesting is if you read through the Gospels, and if you read through Mark especially, Mark takes us through a journey where Jesus simply, and you'll see it very, very soon after Jesus proclaimed, you're the Messiah, Jesus explaining to his disciples, his apostles, but listen, I have to be arrested, I have to be judged, I have to die on a cross and then I have to raise again. He tells them this. He tells them the rest of the story, but they don't believe him. They have a hard time believing that Jesus is actually going to be arrested, that he's going to die, that he's going to be resurrected. They just can't process it in their minds. And Peter especially has an exchange with Jesus where Jesus is explaining to his disciples, listen, I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise on the third day. And Peter's like, don't say that, Jesus. You can't be saying these things to your disciples, to your followers. You're not going to get a lot of followers like that if your big call is you're going to die, okay? That's not going to get you a lot of people, okay? So, and Jesus has some very pointed words for Peter. Get behind me, Satan. Listen, and that's something that the entire apostle crew struggled with, that his followers struggled with this idea. So you see this tension in the story between Peter and Jesus. And the story I want to share with you right now is actually after the Passover meal, we call it Passover meal, where Jesus is having this one last meal with Passover. We talked a little bit about Passover earlier in the series. And Jesus is having this meal with them. He's teaching them what it means to be a disciple. He's teaching them to serve. But then throughout this meal, it gets a little cryptic when he says, Judas, you're gonna be the one to turn me in. You're gonna betray me, Judas, and you're gonna lead me to my death, which is a very odd thing for someone to say at a Passover meal. And so he's talking about this. Well, in the book of Mark, Peter and Jesus are going to what's called the Mount of Olives, and they're walking towards this Mount of Olives. And Jesus has a conversation with Peter. And like I said, it was written through the perspective of Peter, so you know this is pretty reliable. And so they're headed to this Mount of Olives. What you should know is the Mount of Olives is this place that is what it is a graveyard. It's a Jewish graveyard. Many people were buried at the mountain. It's a beautiful place, but it's also a graveyard because they believe that's where the Messiah would come back. And so they wanted to be buried in that area because they believed in the rising of the dead, and they wanted to be buried in the area that the Messiah actually came back. So a lot of people were buried in the Mount of Olives, but they were headed to a graveyard where Jesus was about to be betrayed. And Jesus looks at Peter, and once again, he's talking about his betrayal, he's talking about his death, and then he looks at Peter, and he says, Peter, you're actually going to deny you even know me when this is all said and done. You're actually going to deny me. In fact, 3 times you're going to deny me. And the rooster's going to crow. And he's like, no, Jesus. No. I don't care how bad it gets. I don't care what. I will never walk away. Even if I fall away, he says, even if I fall away, I'll never walk away. Yeah, I'm going to stick with you to the end. Everybody else may leave, but I'm going to stick with you till the end. And so there's this exchange where Peter is just telling Jesus, you're wrong. You're wrong. Well, let me take you to the final act of Peter in Mark chapter 14, verse 66 through 72. While Peter was below in the courtyard, when I say Peter was below in the courtyard, what I mean is that Peter is actually, Jesus has been arrested. And Jesus is following this. Jesus is being sentenced. He's being put on trial, and he's being beaten, and he's being whipped. And Peter's on kind of the outside of the courtyard watching all this happen. It says that he's in the courtyard, and one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. Now, when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. Well, you were also with that Nazarene Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't understand what you're talking about. And so he went out the entryway. So somebody with influence, a child of one of the high priests, somebody with a little influence came by and said, weren't you the guy? Weren't you with Jesus? No. Which okay, let's just say it was the first time, and Peter was a little scared because she was a high priest kid. Okay, they had some, people look at me as a preacher's kid, and I'm pretty important. And right, and so she was like a high priest kid, right? And so she could go back and tell Daddy what he said. And so maybe there was a connection there, and he was scared, and he was, kind of like, okay. So he leaves a little farther away. He wants to get out of that scene. Well, when the servant girl saw him, again, this is the servant girl. This is nothing connected to any high priest. She said again, those who are standing around, this fellow is one of them. And again, he denied it. It's not true. It's not true. And after a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. And he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. And then the Bible says, immediately the rooster crowed the second time. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus had spoken to him. And before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down, and he wept. Curtain closed. Lights off Peter. The last words of Peter. The last thing you see Peter doing. That's it. Mark is done with Peter. Now again, you're the guy telling the story. You're telling Mark what to write. You can do better for yourself at least, right? You can tell Peter, hey, look, include something. I want to hear something after this. But did he choose to leave this out? Or did Peter just not want to say the rest of the story? Why would he leave himself with a denial of Jesus. What's up with that? What's next for him? And if you were reading the story for the first time, why? What's going on here? Because they knew Peter was important to the story, and at that point, he was a pretty big pillar of their faith. At that point, what happened next? How did he get from there to leading this movement? But Mark doesn't tell us. So if Mark were the only book you had to read, were your only gospel, you end with one of his followers saying, I don't know the guy, and weeping about it. That's scene number one. Scene number two is his followers, some women who were actually probably at Jesus' death, at the cross. And when we see them the first time, we see them approaching the grave, or what they think is the grave of Jesus, right? They're coming to anoint him with spices and oil. They want to anoint a dead man, not a living person, a dead person. So they are not coming to praise the risen Jesus. They're coming actually to anoint someone who is already dead. So they're not coming with the idea of anybody being there. And evidently they hadn't thought through this whole thing, because it says they're approaching the tomb and they realize, there's a big stone there. How am I going to get that stone away? And so as they're pondering this idea of how they're going to remove this large stone in front of a grave, the stone's not there. And there's a man standing there. Now, this is where I want to pick up in Mark chapter 16. Don't be alarmed, that person said. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. This is the last line in the original manuscript. So trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. And they said nothing to anyone. Why? They were afraid. Curtains closed, lights off, bookends. Wow. Thanks, Mark. So let me get this straight. The guy who's supposed to be a big deal, one of his main followers, his story ends with not knowing Jesus and weeping. And his followers, they end their story knowing the truth, but too afraid to tell the truth because they don't know. Maybe they're scared of what people were saying. Maybe they didn't believe what they were hearing. Afraid. Bewildered. And the curtain closes. That's it? Mark, what are you doing? I need to know what's next. What's going on? I need more. Why would he do that? Well, I have some ideas. In fact, I have a pretty good idea for the reason he would do something like that. Because when you end this stuff with somebody denying Jesus and weeping, when you end this stuff with someone being afraid to tell a story, you have to go and look deeper into the story. And I want to take you to one more scene in the book of Mark that I think is very interesting. And it's the scene of the cross. Now, the cross is a picture that many of us have either, listen, whether you believe in the resurrection or not, people look at this event, both people who believe in Jesus and both people who don't believe in Jesus. They look at this event of the cross and they look at the way that Romans crucified people, and they see it as a very horrible thing, a very violent thing, a very sad thing. It was torture, okay? And so when people who believe in Jesus or they don't believe in Jesus, they realize that in the history books, you can't deny in the history books, whether you believe it or not, that he went through this, right? He's in there, okay? Not just in religious texts. And when people read about the cross, there's a lot of, I was actually looking for quotes that people said about the cross. The best quote I found was a guy named Scott Dickerson. Have you ever seen Doctor Strange? Or have you ever seen, maybe you've seen some horror movies, Sinister? He's actually, he's involved in those pictures, okay? I don't know if he's a believer or not, but he's involved in those pictures. And he had a quote that I found on the cross. And he actually had the best quote that I found on the cross. This is what he said. He said, the role that blood plays in Christian iconography is huge. The washing of the blood, the shedding of blood, the blood on the cross, the crucifixion, the violence of that imagery. These are horrific. And yet, at the center of the Christian faith, and this is, I love this line, there is a place where beauty and terror merge. And it's at the cross. Isn't that powerful? There is a place where beauty and terror come together. And it is the cross. And there was a man standing under the cross that day. It was a Roman soldier, watching everything unfold. And what we find out about this Roman soldier is very interesting, because what you have to remember is this Roman soldier had seen this 1,000 times. He had seen men after men after men be crucified. This was not his first crucifixion. But something about this crucifixion changed him. Changed him. And as he stood there, he was watching Jesus die. And the first thing he saw are people ridiculing Jesus. In Mark chapter 14, verse 31 through 39, they said, he saved others. He can't save himself. Let the Messiah, and of course that was sarcastic, let the Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see and believe. Let this guy who's been claiming he's the King of Israel, let this guy, they weren't happy enough to just beat him physically. They had to beat him verbally, right? And let this Messiah, if he's really a Messiah, let him come down. And at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. And I said first service, I'm not a Greek Hebrew guy. I didn't take those classes very well. And so I'm not even going to attempt to say what Jesus said in their language, okay? But I'm going to give you the English version because I do know that. My God, why have you forsaken me? And when some of those standing near heard this, they kept ridiculing Jesus. He's calling Elijah. Now leave him alone. Leave him alone. Let Elijah come down and save him. Let Elijah come down and pull him off the cross. Maybe he needs help coming off the cross. So when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, these were his last words. Surely this man was the Son of God. Surely this man is who he said he is. Think about that. Now think about the people hearing this for the first time. Let me ask you something. If you were a Jewish person being persecuted for your faith by the Roman government, and the only person in the book of Mark who truly believes that Jesus is the Son of God is a Roman soldier who has no reason to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but only sees him die on the cross. And here's the kicker. He doesn't need to know anything else. He hasn't seen the resurrection. He may not even know about the resurrection, yet he sees Jesus die on a cross, and he's ready to say, truly, this man is the Son of God. How do they process that? How do we process that? How do we process the fact that the only person willing to say it is the only person that doesn't need to see the resurrection? Because Peter, the reason he denied Jesus is because he hadn't seen the resurrection yet. And he didn't understand it. And he needed to see it. And he wasn't going to proclaim Jesus Messiah truly until he saw that resurrection. And the women, even though they knew it, they hadn't seen it. And they were terrified to talk about it because they hadn't seen Jesus yet. And I'm not saying it, and I'm not talking about it until I truly, truly see it. I've got to see this if I'm going to believe it. And then there's this soldier who doesn't need to see a thing. But he believes. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the point. See, I don't live in a world where there's a little happy bow tied on the end of every story in life. Do you live in that world? See, I live in a world with pain and suffering, and I don't know how that pain and suffering is going to end. I still have questions. I see people suffering I see people in third world countries and people in other countries. Their government is oppressing them for their faith. I see Christians being martyred a lot in the world we live in today. And Jesus is not coming down to help them. And the people who were reading this story, they were reading this story and Jesus wasn't coming down to help them. They were going to go through years and years and years of persecution, years of death. And Jesus wasn't coming down then. And they needed to see something, right? Where are you, Jesus, in all this, right? I live in a world where people lose their jobs. Or people hate their jobs. And they don't know where their next job is coming. And they don't know how they're going to provide for their kids. And they're in the middle of it. And they're going, Jesus, where are you? I need a miracle. I need to make a paycheck. Jesus, I'm in the middle of this. There's no bow. I'm looking for the bow. I know it should be true. I've heard about you. And I've heard about this resurrection. But I don't know if it's true. And I don't know if you're going to come through on this, right? I live in a world where families have to deal with a lot of stuff. Where they have to deal with things like a really difficult diagnosis. And this diagnosis, I don't know how it's going to turn out. It could be terminal. Jesus, are you going to make this? Are you going to perform a miracle on this? Are you going to do something about this? I don't know how I have faith in all of that. Because some of those stories, they don't end with the bow. They don't end with Jesus miraculously coming down and making a great story out of it, right? I see families deal with divorce and addiction. How do those stories end? I don't know. Because I live in a world where everything doesn't end with a bow. And I need to know what's next, but sometimes I don't know the rest of the story. Even though I've been told the story, I have a tough time having faith that it's true. And sometimes I read stories where people have to stand in front of caskets. And they have to look at their loved one. And they have to bury them. And sometimes they lived a good life. And sometimes it's too soon. And I have to process that. And we have to process that. And there's no bow. There's no bow at the end of that story. And maybe Mark is giving us a story to say this. Jesus wants us to believe before we see. We need to believe that Jesus Messiah is Jesus Messiah before we are ever able to see the end. Can we do that? And isn't that what faith really is? Having confidence in the things that we don't understand and we don't see. That's faith. That's what he's trying to tell us. And through this pain, this suffering, all the things that we go through. In fact, Jesus said in another gospel, he said, because you have seen me, you believe. But blessed are those who have not seen, and yet they believe. Blessed are you, because you've seen me, you believe. But blessed are those who have not seen, and yet they believe. Blessed are those who go through pain and persecution and suffering. Blessed are those, instead of walking away from Jesus, use that and they draw closer to Jesus. And they say, Jesus, I don't know what you're doing. God, I don't know what you're doing, and I'm going through a really rough time. But you know what? I'm not going to run away from you. I'm going to use this and I'm going to draw closer because I need you now more than ever. And blessed is the man, blessed is the woman who loses their job or has struggles with their job, and they don't know where their next paycheck is coming. And instead of saying, God, I'm done with you, I'm going to do this all myself, I'm going to rely on you, God. You know what you're doing right here. I know you provide. Your scripture says it. I'm just going to have to rely on you to be God, and I'm just going to have to crawl up in your arms and trust that you know what you're doing. I'm going to have faith in you. Blessed is the family who's going through addiction and going through divorce, and they don't know what they're going to do next, and they don't give up on love, and they don't give up on the next story of their life, and they don't give up on the fact that nothing can come out of addiction. God, you can use my addiction, you can use my divorce to teach me something and to get me through that. So blessed is the person who relies on Jesus, even though they don't see the outcome, but they know that he's got you. He loves you. He cares about you. He's hurting with you. I've heard the story. I believe it. I believe it. Blessed is the person who has to stand in front of the casket and look at their loved one. But they look at that person who's passed, and they're not hopeless, but they have hope. You know why? Because we serve a risen Savior. And if our Savior has beaten death, then he's beaten that. And one day, I will see them again. And through the pain and the tears and the suffering, I know that I can have hope in the future. That one day, God will come through. It's not over. And I have hope for another day that I will see them once again. And blessed is the Roman soldier standing at the foot of the cross and saying, truly, this man is the Son of God. Truly, this man is who he says he is. I don't need to see a resurrection because I've seen the cross. We're going to do our invitation. And here's the thing. John's going to come up and he's going to talk to you guys in a couple of weeks. And we're going to talk about the resurrection. We're going to celebrate Easter. He's going to talk to you about what resurrection means. But here's my invitation this morning. My invitation this morning is simply to believe in Jesus.